All right, what's going on, people? We're back. It's the Talkin TV podcast. And wait, you're not Chris?
No, I'm definitely not.
No, Pat. What are you doing here? Did I invite you here, or did you just like accidentally get the stream link? Did you hack me? Did I get hacked? Am I getting catfished here?
We were talking with each other, and I was like, "Hey, this brand new show started."
Yeah,
and I watched it, and you were like,
"Well,
are you watching? I know that much, or
this much is true." Yeah, that just goes to show you how much you know is true.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like, see, you said just this show, and I was like, okay, I feel like there's a little bit more to this in this show. Consider the fact that this is like, again, like just getting all pretenses out of the way. This is the first major HBO production that like basically shot in like both yours and mine's backyard. Right,
yeah.
like literally, like that. We're not being facetious at all. Like they shot.
I drove by the production, plenty of times because it's literally 2 minutes from where I'm staying right now.
Like I noticed some shots in the show that I'm like, okay, I drive by those, like there were like Vassar College, like Route 9, like stuff in Poughkeepsie. I'm like, okay, I'm like, these are basically like my backyard, like literally. Like this is a little bit uncanny and ridiculous, but. Hey, at least we can say that this was the thing that was shot in our hometown now, right?
Yeah, and one thing I will say is I got my setup perfect for how this was shot.
Yeah, right.
They shot in nice, like, tight shots.
Yep, nice, tight, a lot of close-ups, a lot of blurred out backgrounds.
Yeah, very dramatic. So I got my dramatic lighting going on. So I feel like I'm fitting the theme.
Yeah. No, it looks good, dude. It looks good. But yeah, once again, people, welcome to the Talkin TV podcast. This is a little bit more of a low-key, fun episode, but it's also kind of a professional episode. I'm Dom, the movie nerd. Chris, the TV nerd, unfortunately could not be here tonight for reasons that were out of his control. And so I decided to bring in one of our local people. I'll get the camera directions eventually once. One of our local people, one of our first ever guests, one of our mostly recurring guests, the one, the only great, Patrick W. Huber, to kind of act as my co-host. He was going to be on this episode regardless because he had some points to bring to the topic of discussion today. But hey, Pat's a great guy. We love having him around. He's always brings some very insightful points to the table, even if I don't necessarily agree with them all the time. But hey, that's the beauty of the internet, right? We can all disagree and pretend to like each other, even though we hate each other through our teeth. I'm just kidding. But anyways, so Pat, as we were kind of thinly hinting at before, we've got a new thing to talk about today, a new HBO thing. Before we get into it, Pat, what's your kind of history / relationship with HBO's original programming?
For the most part, I would say HBO Go, roommate having that, had the password, and I just started binge watching a lot of stuff.
Big help there.
Caught up on like Sopranos, Deadwood, 6 Feet Under, all those kind of like shows. And it's been like a hit or miss because I've lost the subscription, and then I paid for it for
now
a while.
Came around, so like you couldn't just replace it.
No, it's one of those things. There's so many streaming services out there that HBO is not necessarily my go-to, but every once in a while, like when Game of Thrones was on, I would usually subscribe and basically binge watch, and then when the season was over, boom, it's time to move on.
Yeah, I guess just my thing with it and kind of why I always held HBO like to a certain echelon. Like, see, for me, I feel like this is the case for a lot of people too. It was like Netflix and then everything else is secondary. But for me, like there were always like two that like were held in echelon. Because like Amazon gave me access to a bunch of stuff, even if it wasn't necessarily original programming. But like HBO has been like my go-to like since high school, like since Game of Thrones. And that just gave me access to like a bevy of other television. Because the thing about HBO is they are the one TV network where like just whatever the random project that they're doing is, it seems to always churn out quality. Like I don't think, even with some of their weaker shows, I don't think I've seen a single thing from them that I haven't enjoyed. And like they've got a wide variety of material, like going from Sopranos, which is kind of where they made their mark. They had Oz before that, but Sopranos is really where they made their arc. Deadwood, 6 Feet Under, The Wire, Boardwalk Empire, obviously Game of Thrones most recently, but even like their comedies too. Like they had like one of the go-to comedies that's kicked off in the 90s with Sex and the City, and then they kind of followed it up with Entourage. Like they're known for their quality overall. And more recently, they started to get into miniseries, right? They had Watchmen in the fall, which Chris and I already talked about, which was absolutely revolutionary to me. But something interesting I've noticed is that not just HBO is doing, but a lot of other networks recently have gotten into the idea of doing the miniseries kind of as an extended movie. It's something that I don't necessarily remember who was the first one to kick this off. I think Netflix was doing this first a little bit. I think the first thing that really stood out to me, though, was when Netflix did Haunting of Hill House, right? The Mike Flanagan show. And that was kind of like the first example of them doing a movie, basically, but like as separate episodes. Like, people like to credit Stranger Things with that, but I'm like, no, Stranger Things was much more so like a regular TV show. And since then, HBO's like had like a couple of things that they've done that with, like they did Chernobyl, which was only 5 episodes, but that like to me was like basically an extended movie, they've had a couple of other things. And so today we're doing, I would say, the latest example of that. It's another miniseries, only 6 episodes. Again, as we very not subtly hinted at, shot in our hometown between Poughkeepsie, LaGrange, and Wappingers Falls, New York. Whoop, whoop. We're finally on the map at last, as if we weren't already with A Quiet Place. But A Quiet Place was shot in New Paltz, so that's not really our turf. But Pat, this is also a special episode because besides the fact that we're actually getting to talk about I Know This Much Is True, we actually are lucky enough to be joined by a crew member who actually worked on the show. So I guess you could say this is kind of our first ever celebrity interview. I don't know. Would you say that?
Sure. Anybody that's a part of the process that can share all of Mark Ruffalo's dirty secrets behind the scene, that'd be great.
Oh, and this guy has definitely got some dirty secrets, Mark Ruffalo. So people, without further ado, let me introduce the one, the only, my good friend going back to high school, an official Locations crew member for I Know This Much Is True. Please welcome the one, the only, Mr. Brendan Lynch. Brendan, what's going on, dude? As your
sorry, I had my
quick sound technical difficulties.
Yeah, I was chomping on some snacks beforehand because I just got back from a bike ride and I didn't eat anything.
Didn't want those crunching noises to get it over the other. I completely understand. I've been there myself.
But yeah, thanks for having me on, guys.
Of course, dude.
I appreciate it. I wouldn't consider myself a celebrity, but thank you. I can't stop.
Come on, dude.
I can't stop smiling.
Are you kidding me? You were the one guy from high school who I was like, wait. Well, because the whole thing with me is that like there were a ton of people that I knew in high school that ended up like either being also into movies that I didn't know while we were in high school that I didn't find out until afterwards, and then like also like ended up working on like major productions. And it's funny because I think the first time I saw you like after high school was I was going to a background extras job on a movie, and I just saw you walking around the set. I'm like, Brandon?
I do remember that. I remember I saw you. That was for a Trick that also shot in the area. I was at the props department then. I was a props PA. And I remember seeing you, and I was like, "Hey, what's up, Dom?" And you're like, "What are you doing here?" And I'm like, "I'm working." You're like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "I'm working."
Yeah, but
and honestly, it's great. It's great seeing you too. I'm glad that you were also, part of it as well in the industry up here. But
absolutely, well, kind of, sort of. I would more so consider it just like kind of getting lucky and knowing certain people.
I mean that's what the film biz is. It's like a lot of people think you go to school and you're guaranteed a job like most people out of school. Not at all. But I mean, I had to work my butt off. And for a time I wasn't even in the film. I was working part-time jobs and just shooting my shot anytime there was a production, like, hey, if you need a PA, you need me,
that's how it works.
And then you finally, someone's like, all right, you know what, get this kid on here. He keeps blowing up my email, and then
you'll get your one
thing, and then you do a good job, and they get you on the next ones. I mean, that Trick was one of my first big movies that I did, and the way I did that, it was an independent film that shot up here in Newburgh. I got that from working with the prop master on another show in across the river. I believe it was Middletown. We were shooting The Food That Built America season 1, and I was just a PA on that for a few days, and then they called me back. I was an art PA on that for a few days, and I was like just painting walls and stuff, and then they called me back because they needed someone for another week, and that's where I met the prop master Thor Voss, and he called me. I remember I was working at H&M. He called me. He's like, "Hey man, I got a movie. There's gonna be a lot of blood. There's going to be a lot of stuff,
blood and gore. You want to be a part of it?" You're like, "How can I refuse?"
And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, yeah. And I literally went to my boss. Question. I went to my boss and I was like, "I'm sorry, I'm quitting." And then for a month I was on a movie, and it was literally my first movie ever.
That's awesome.
But yeah, that's really, I mean, that's how it is. It's not like it's crazy. It's a crazy process.
You got to hustle. It's a hustle. It's
you got to hustle.
Non-stop hustle.
And on set, it is a hustle.
The networking is cannot be overstated. It's basically one of my biggest jobs came from the fact that I was an assistant editor on a horse rodeo documentary, and then my resume landed on the desk of a major broadcasting company, and I did some work for them for a couple of years. So, it's one of those things. Your friends basically talk you up. And then
you
can do the job.
You can show up and you do the job. Exactly.
Yeah. Then you get a call. It's like, hey, you got a trial. Come on in and let's do this.
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, that's how it works. I mean, it's like one job leads to another. I said before, I mean, you got to do your best job on the one job. And then, hopefully they recommend you to somebody who's also, it's not like, like after Trick, I was kind of jobless for a bit because it was my first movie ever. I didn't do anything wrong. It was nothing I did. It's just how the process is.
That's just how the process goes. Yeah. So kind of walk us through the process then. How did you end up getting on I Know This Person? Because that was like that. The whole thing about that show is that was a big project. Like even before I knew what the title was, I just like saw all the Facebook posts. It's like HBO miniseries, HBO Mark Ruffalo miniseries shooting in the Hudson Valley. And that's kind of all it took, right? And because like everybody knew who Mark Ruffalo was by that point, because obviously of his work with the Marvel movies. But yeah, just kind of walk us through the process. Like, how did that go? Like, I just want to know like what it was like. Cause like, obviously like I tried to get on that show as a background extra so many different times and I couldn't even get like the basic screening process. I couldn't even get through it. Then like working as a crew behind the scenes, like walk us through that process.
It's a process. And like you said, it was huge. And that's the main reason why I mean, it's the biggest production I've worked on, but basically it's funny. I was doing yard work for my neighbor and she used to be in the industry. Like she used to PA and like do some other stuff. And she got an email and she was like, hey, HBO shooting here. They need a PA and I'm not really doing it anymore. Do you want it? And I was like, are you serious?
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, it's for 2 weeks. I mean, they're just looking for somebody. Like at the time I was what they call a additional PA, production assistant. So basically it's when they need just some extra bodies. Because there's actually a difference between like set PA, the people they get hired from the beginning and they're guaranteed the whole show.
Right.
And I was only guaranteed 2 weeks. So I was like, you know what? I got nothing better to do. I'm doing yard work. It's a nice change of pace. So I emailed the key PA, Jose, and I said, hi, my name is Brendan Lynch. Here's my resume. So-and-so recommended me for this position. Let me know if it's available. And he's like, all right, I'll get back to you. And then I basically, the whole deal, you wait a little bit and you pester him like, hey, just want to let you know I'm still into doing it. So just let me know when I can start.
Please let me know.
He's like, yeah, I'll let you know. If anything, book these 3 days. And I was like, all right, cool. So I was at least 3 days on. It wasn't the 2 weeks that I was promised, like not that I was promised them, but I was like, all right, 3 days, that's fine. So I show up and I'm here on set and I'm just like, oh my God, like I'm in Poughkeepsie. It's like I got the call sheet and I was like, oh my God, this is like awesome. I'm right down the road from my house. Like it took me 5 minutes to get there. And I'm sitting there, I did my job, PAs, it's nothing crazy. You're making sure no one walks on set that's from the public. If someone needs something, you basically do the grease of the cogs that are of spinning of the whole production. So you're just making sure everything goes smoothly. And, I did my job and, they're like, hey, we need someone for next week. Are you available? And I was like, yeah, sure. And it basically, at the end of each week, I was asked if I was available to a point where they're like, hey, can you book like these weeks? And I'm like, heck yeah. And I ended up working majority of the show. When I joined in, they were about 2 weeks into filming.
Okay.
And then from there, I was basically on every single day. And it was great. It was awesome.
How long of a shoot was it?
It was like 6 months, 6 to 7. Okay. Well, for them altogether, I think it was like about a year. I mean, they were there a few months beforehand doing pre-production and all that stuff, but filming wise, it was about 6 or 7 months. If I'm doing the math right. I mean, they started, I want to say they started, I joined April, like the last week of April last year. And from there, I went all the way, I guess till almost December. I want to say pretty much right up until like the new year. It was crazy because that's when I started my next job. Because it was crazy. It was just how perfect it worked out. I mean, for 6 months I was working on a movie, like a TV set. Yeah. I mean, it was basically a giant movie, like you were saying before, like it was miniseries. It's like a giant movie. We basically shot 6 movies, and it was a ride, and it was one of the best crews I've ever worked with. Even to the day, like. There's crews like after that show that I'm like, they're not bad. It's just like there was something about that crew that was just so amazing. Like
that HBO, like there's a reason
that
why
HBO energy. It wasn't even the HBO though.
Them.
It was just the quality of the show. I mean, Derek, the director. I mean,
we'll get into him.
We'll get into him. Don't worry. I mean, he's an amazing director to work with, and I mean, the few times I have actually spoken to him, you know, like when I actually got the courage to be like, hey, Derek, I love your work. I just want to say hi and just be like, thanks for having me on. I mean, I know you have you don't even know who I am. You don't even know, like, you're not the person who actually hires me. I just want to say I'm glad to be in your presence. But the way he shoots things, it's just crazy. Like, it's a very like it's not your traditional stuff, you know, but it was a blast. And the product, just seeing it, watching these 6 episodes, it's just like, wow. That really paid off.
It's definitely a difference between somebody who kind of sees it from the outside as just like a regular viewer versus somebody who was actually in it and like worked on it every day and then gets to see the final product,
some days. Right? Oh my God.
And especially like it must be so satisfying to see something that like even be just a small part of it and then seeing the result of it and see just how good it could be. That must have been like, oh man, like
it was amazing. I mean, like you said, you see, like it was the best part of it is what not only was it was a big production, it was in our backyard. So we basically shot in places I was like, I know where this place is. I mean, it's like a lot of the locations you say we're in Poughkeepsie, and I'm just like, even watching the show, I'm like, I remember that day. I remember what we were doing that day. I remember being there for like X amount of times. We did that scene like X amount of times, and it's only like a 3-second. Like they only showed 3 seconds of it, and I'm like
it's crazy. Like to me, the scene. I mean, I recognize most locations of the show. A couple of the scenes from across the river I wasn't too familiar with because obviously we're on this side of the river. But like the scene where he parks in front of the therapist's office in the second episode, I'm like, that's the freaking plaza that's like where we ironically enough like eat at Buffalo Wild Wings every like after whatever we saw a movie last year. It was nuts. I'm like, oh wow. Like Dustin, like I had a friend who said the same thing. It's like, wow, they literally shot in his backyard. They were not kidding there.
Yeah, no, and it's funny, they actually the dance school and that Chinese food place that actually kept, like, those are that's not changed, like that's actually the Chinese food place and the studio upstairs.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I mean, that was a big thing with Derek. He likes shooting on location, so like
that's awesome.
They really like, and I loved it because it was just like just showcasing my home, you know, and it was just.
It's got to be a good feeling. Yeah. So people, for the viewers, just so that you guys know, the director who we're talking about, the director who did all 6 episodes of this show is a director named Derek Cianfrance. If you're not familiar with that name, this is a guy who directed a movie in 2010 called Blue Valentine, starring Ryan Gosling and Michelle Williams. And in 2012, he actually directed one of this guy's favorite movies of the decade, that being The Place Beyond the Pines, starring Ryan Gosling and Bradley Cooper. What's it called? Pat, you've seen Place Beyond the Pines. Kind of describe like your relationship so far with like Derek's previous work so far and like what you kind of admire.
The Place Beyond the Pines is the only thing I've seen of his besides this show. And I would say that it's that movie is a really good, solid story. And the structure is sort of the passing of the torch. You know, if you are into film and you've studied screenwriting, you're talking about like act 1, act 2, act 3. And this movie is structured in a way where you have act 1, Ryan Gosling, and then his character sort of passes the torch onto Bradley Cooper. And Bradley Cooper then passes the torch onto their characters' kids. And so the interesting part about that story is sort of you are following multiple protagonists as they have a shared journey, you know, and it's just sort of about, you know, living on different sides of the track and, you know, how, you know, one guy has to sort of hustle for himself to survive. And then the other one is part of the institution, police force, and sort of the two of them eventually collide. And it's about how each of their lives really impacts each other. And I think it's a really brilliant film. And so even though I haven't seen any of his other work, when I found out that he was the one kind of doing this show, I was like, okay, I'm going to definitely keep HBO for one more month or whatever. And basically,
as long as I can afford to pay it.
Well, yeah, it's more being a cheapskate than anything else, but not so much a cheapskate that I pirate things and sort of don't support the industry. So I definitely pay my subscription, support people that work on these shows, and you know, any way I can. So
absolutely.
So Place Beyond the Ponds, definitely recommend it if you like this show. Even if you were mild on this show, Place Beyond the Pines is fantastic. So
it's interesting because I was a guy who always knew who Derek was, but I was never familiar with his work because I was too young. I missed Blue Valentine and Place Beyond the Pines in theaters. My actual first introduction to him was with his third movie that he did in 2016, which I personally was not the biggest fan of, that being The Light Between Oceans, starring Michael Fassbender and Alicia Vikander. That movie, I understood what it was going for, but that was just an example of it was kind of too slow paced. Like any kind of semblance of story just kind of got lost in the shuffle, and it also felt really repetitive too. So, and if anything, like I said, I just kind of felt bad because I'm like, wow, I know that this has the semblance of being a great movie. This is just not for me, you know. But the whole thing is that the only name that I knew that was attached to the show at first was Ruffalo, right? I had no idea that Derek was involved until I think like somebody in my Facebook film group posted about this and said, oh, the new Derek Cianfrance. I'm like, wait, that's who's directing this? Oh, like, I mean, I was already on board to begin with because, you know, Mark Ruffalo HBO miniseries shot in my hometown. But yeah, so to kind of break it down, kind of now actually kind of jumping ship into the actual show itself. So the show is called I Know This Much Is True. It's based off of a 1998 novel written by Wally Lamb, I believe is the writer's name originally. And it features Mark Ruffalo as the lead characters, I should say, actually, because in this show, he's playing twins, Dominick and Thomas Birdsey, who are the result of a kind of, I'm not going to say like, yeah, they believe that they were the result of a cursed lineage. Dominick is always kind of had to look out for Thomas being a paranoid schizophrenic diagnosed at an early age. And the show is kind of a breakdown of their respective like how they grew up, kind of their characteristics and how they kind of attribute that to family lineage and how that, and also like what the show statements are on just mental health and depression in general. And if I could just start by breaking down my thoughts after having finished the show wrapped its 6th and final episode this past Sunday, the 14th. If I'm looking at my calendar, that's right there. Ironically enough, my Game of Thrones calendar. Definitely not a subtle plug. HBO, please fund us. But yeah, so my thoughts on this overall were I definitely feel like I definitely understood Derek's stance in the sense of it was almost kind of like Winding Refn-esque in the sense of like it's very slow, very methodically shot type of statement piece. And a lot of it can kind of seem very humbling and very kind of melodramatic and very kind of, okay, I don't necessarily know where this is going per se, but it was also one of the shows where every episode when it ended, I was like, okay, I gotta see what happens next. And the story itself was always fascinating, but it was another one of those things where I'm like, okay, I can definitely tell this is like a small piece of a greater whole, you know, which is something that I feel like a lot of HBO productions have done so far, and I think have done really well. Like that's kind of like why HBO became what they were, you know, it was kind of changing the game of television and kind of showing that television could be more than just like disposable media that just relies on the same tropes and camera techniques. Like the whole thing about Sopranos that made it so revolutionary was the fact that it was shot. It was like you were watching a film a week, you know, and HBO kind of took that model and ran with it. And it's why I think they're still like one of the go-to networks today, you know? So I guess, Brandon, do you kind of have the same thought? Like, what was your kind of like thought process on HBO, you know, like even before you started working on the show?
Before the show, honestly, I honestly didn't watch that many things. Like I literally just got HBO now, you know, for the show. I know there was always great stuff on it. So when I heard that, they were shooting that up here and that I was going to be working on it, I was really excited, especially when I just know the budgets of film and just like the type of the products they have, you know, like seeing things like people saying good reviews and just knowing what HBO was, you know? But honestly, yeah, before this, I wasn't really watching HBO stuff. Surprisingly, like, ironically,
not even Game of Thrones.
No, I'm not a Game of Thrones fan. No, I watch streaming, but I'm one of those guys who's like really late to the game, and like I'll be like, oh, okay. I finally got, like, I had Netflix or like my friend's Netflix, you know, like I didn't have any of my own personal stuff. So yeah, and I finally got HBO. Now I'm like, oh my god, I'm missing out on all this stuff. Like I literally have a list. I was only gonna do it for like, I was like, oh, I'll just watch the first 2 episodes.
That's how it always starts.
And then I was like, oh, and then like when it comes out, maybe on DVD, if it does, I'll get it, or you know, I'll just watch it another time. And then you're like, oh, hey, that's. And then you asked me if I want to do the show, and I was like, well, I guess I should. I mean, I want to. And then I was like, I guess I could get it for like the month of HBO that I need to watch the show or so. And then I ended up it's one of my streaming things. That and Hulu are one of my top
Yeah, you go down a rabbit hole. It's nothing but quality. Like I said, even those shows that like haven't been great, like they're still like just so many miles above like so many other streaming services. Like everyone credits Netflix, but I really feel like HBO was the one that set the bar when it comes to just quality overall among streaming.
For sure.
I also feel HBO really early on did shorter seasons, 1 hour episodes, and sort of kind of set themselves up for streaming and binging just by the nature of their library. So many shows that are just like 10 episode seasons, and as a viewer, it's like, if I'm not digging this season, well, there's only a few more episodes left, and then maybe the next season's a little bit better. So they kind of set themselves up for that sort of shorter, more bingeable content.
It's funny because it's something that I feel like a lot of the networks were trying to do at first. You know, like the big thing for me, like the first example that comes to mind is Arrested Development, where that show like was kind of doing that model of like kind of like this more serialized storytelling that was like meant to be binged, but on like a network scale, like week to week, like kind of before that was even a thing, you know. And if anything, this kind of what hurt that show in the long run. But HBO had already been kind of doing that model for like 5 or 6 years by that point, you know. So like they kind of like got the streaming service and like that sort of storytelling over a long form content down long before like Netflix became popular and everything. But so Pat, I guess my question for you now is, and this is where the hot takes start to roll, do you feel that HBO continued with that model very well with this show?
Well, with this show, I think it's a little complex because mainly I think the last time I was talking with you, Dom, I was joking how I don't like any television or movies, and
but here's the thing,
I'm thinking about just reading books.
Yeah, with me knowing you, I couldn't actually tell if that was you being serious or that was you joking. Because I think part of the reason why Chris likes you so much, and I like you too, is because like when it comes to you joking versus you being serious, there's not too much of a difference in your facial expression, so it's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, I'm pretty much monotone, even keel the whole time. You know, joking, mad, everything. So you know. Yeah, it's anyway. The main thing is like the fact that this was from a book. You know, me watching content that is definitely taken and transferred from one medium to the other. I just start noticing, okay, something is missing from the book. And so there's a lot of moments throughout this TV show where I'm like always criticizing and being like, okay, here's an example. Julia Lewis, right? She's in this. I was surprised. I was like, oh, she's in this. This is great. She's going to have this involved character and it's going to be interesting. And like, I'm supporting her a lot. And
gone after that first episode.
She was in one other kind of sequence in the first episode, which was great and had this big impact. But then she was in like one other scene where she just sort of tossed this manuscript right back to Dominick.
Ironically enough, which contributed to your favorite plot development later on in the show. But
I think the manuscript is great. So definitely like how that plot line played out. But the main thing is like with an ensemble cast like this, and you're getting these embodiment of these characters, and then they only have so much screen time. And so you end up thinking, man, if I just stopped watching the show and started reading the book, I would have a lot more pages with this character and I would feel it's a little more fleshed out. So I don't know. I think that's my bounce of constantly reading and constantly watching movies and televisions and stuff. Like that bounce always strikes me a little bit weird.
It's a tricky bounce to accomplish, and it's definitely something that I feel like just us as media, our two respective generations. You know, me and Brendan being Gen Zers, you being a millennial, obviously, like that's kind of a common trend that has afflicted both of our generations. You know, us being such media junkies, we are kind of trained to recognize every single little trope. So obviously, movies and TV and just stories in general don't flow the same way. But yeah, you were mentioning the cast, and yeah, this was a stacked cast because besides Ruffalo playing the main two characters, like I noticed, and it was a different type of a cast too that I'm used to, but like all mainstay players like Kathryn Hahn, Juliette Lewis, Archie Punjabi, Rosie O'Donnell, who turned out to be probably my favorite supporting player.
She was really good.
She was
For sure.
Incredible. Melissa Leo as their mom.
Yeah,
who lesser known
not enough screen time.
Yep.
Let's say.
Agreed.
It should have been the Melissa Leo show, but I'm a big Treme fan, so you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, look, I saw her on I'm Dying Up Here last year, and RIP that show. That show was gone way too soon. But actually 2 years. Oh my god, it's been 2 years since that show ended. Anyways, that's not the point. The point being RIP I'm Dying Up Here. That was like the best thing that Showtime had in years, and they canceled it before it actually had a chance to flourish. So I'm not gonna let my personal feelings get in the way. But yeah, this is a really, really good cast, and I thought that they were all very well utilized. But yeah, it's a trick of, I guess I didn't read the book that this is based on, so I was just kind of like,
you have to. I
plan on it. But the whole thing was that, like, I have no idea what the show, all that I knew that it was about was that I'm like, okay, it's about twins. One of them's got a serious mental illness. What is this going to be about? And then I understood. I'm like, okay, so this is kind of telling the story of like kind of how mental health affects different generations in different ways, but also kind of like providing connective material between the two. You know, it's a different type of a story, and it was definitely a very, very slow burn. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, I kind of get this, you know? So if we're kind of breaking down now, like just taking aside the overall, like what the show is about, kind of like, well, first of all, I just wanted to get your take, Brandon. Like, I mean, you finished the show, you finished watching it. Like, how did it measure up, like, with you watching it as opposed to, like, you know, you were there working on it? You talked with Ruffalo, you talked with Derek a little bit, you know?
Besides working on it, like, separating myself from that, watching the show, I mean, I was blown away. Like, it was great. And it was just from reading the book as well. It was, you know, like Patrick said, you know, there's definitely a lot more characters. Like I wish there was a little more from some characters, but I understand why. I mean, there's only 6 episodes. There's only so much screen time for each character. But honestly, the story that was told through the show, honestly, it's just crazy. I mean, you're there one day working, you're just working, and you're like, you kind of see what's going on. I mean, at the time when I was working on the show, I was still reading the book, so I didn't understand what the whole story was about.
Right, because they're obviously shooting bits and pieces. So
that too, and when you're shooting it, you're not shooting it in order. So there's like, you see stuff like we were shooting some of the end stuff near the beginning near the end, you know, and all this stuff. And I at the end of the show, I started kind of piecing together while also reading the book. So I'm like, this is the scene I just read in my book.
Right.
But honestly, it was crazy. I mean, it was great. The episode ended, and then the credits just roll, and you're just like, oh my God. And then you just start seeing everybody who works. And that was probably the best part of the show. And like, crazy enough, I mean, the credits is just seeing everyone, and you're just reminded how many people worked on the show, and how many hands, you know, movies aren't just the directors are making, it's a whole crew, you know, it's a village. I mean, we had
a lot of
almost 200 people or more, like some days just working on this show. And it was crazy. It's honestly, it's a weird feeling working on a show and then seeing it. You're just like, I sat out there for 12 hours and this is it. This is the scene. You know, I did this for 6 months and this is it. I mean, like some things you're like, oh my God, I remember that scene. This came out perfect. And then some you're like, wow, I remember doing this X amount of times, different ways, angles and stuff. And they didn't use any of it. And you're like, I got that sunburn for nothing.
Yeah, definitely. That's how it works. You know, you're on there some days and they use the takes and it's great. And then other days you're like, oh man, that didn't make it in. That's disappointing. But I guess so. The whole point of this show was definitely trying to make a stance on mental health and mental illness, you know, because the basic idea is that Dominick has always had to feel that he's had to care for his twin brother, Thomas. It's kind of that, you know, double-edged sword of like where he's my brother and I love him, but at the same time, he is kind of starting to become a burden. And the whole crux is that at the end of the first episode, there's a semi screw up and Thomas, you know, because the show takes place in 1990s, obviously the stance is very different on mental illness, and Thomas ends up getting placed in like a hardcore, like max facility, almost like a jail, right? Mm-hmm. And the whole rest of the show, Dominick is struggling to cope with that. He's having to deal with problems on his own end. He's trying to get his brother out. He's dealing with stuff that came up in their past. You know, like there's a lot of focus that's put on their stepfather, Ray, and the abuse that they had to deal with there. Dominick's also got a live-in girlfriend played by Imogen Poots, who is pretty much sleeping around. Like they never explicitly say, but they don't really have to say either. It becomes pretty obvious.
Her as the girlfriend was one of the confusing moments because I thought she was just his roommate. Like he needed someone to help share the burden of rent and she was hanging out with other people. But I guess they clarified that relatively quick, and I got on board. But I think that goes back to my earlier point of just this being so economically put together that you can't just possibly always pick up on it as a viewer right away. Sometimes you have to kind of let it digest a little bit.
Right.
But I want to go back, Dominic. The show opens pretty much with Thomas, the twin brother with the mental illness,
right?
And he's in a library, and basically he's making a sacrifice to God.
Yeah.
And he cuts his hand off. And I think one of the funniest moments in the first episode, and maybe this is the little bit of humor that exists in this show, is the doctor basically saying, "Oh, usually they stop about a quarter of the way through. This guy must have been committed." And it's like what? A really dark joke.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're like, "Oh yeah, that's kind of funny."
Yeah.
And then you just get dark for the rest of the show.
For the rest of it's just miserable. And then that's kind of part of the semi charm of the show is, yes, this was a very dark, miserable show. Just saying, it's dealing with mental health and I don't think there's a single happy person on this entire show. Everyone in this show is got baggage. Everyone in the show has demons. And I just was looking at this. I'm like, I get it that we're not supposed to laugh. Obviously, this isn't kind of the most ideal form of entertainment. People usually don't watch things in order to be miserable. They usually watch it in order to be happy. But my whole thing is I actually did kind of find this therapeutic. I don't know if it was just because of the fact that this is the first character in mainstream media besides Vin Diesel from those goddamn Fast and Furious movies that has the same name as me. But it was really weird because his last name is Birdsey. But there were a couple people on the show that said it fast enough. So for a second, I thought they were saying my last name, and I was I thought this, and it's Dominick. I'm like, wait, what? Did that show just actually call my name? It was really weird. And so, but taking all that aside from it, it was really interesting kind of seeing if I'm just opening up a bit, because I had a stay in a mental hospital the last week of college for me. And I just even obviously 2019 versus 1990 is completely different standards. But yeah, it was definitely a place that I never want to be again. And I know for a fact now that I have no existing mental symptoms, but to be in that sort of a place is just miserable, and just kind of the stress and the fear that Dominick has to deal with. I think Derek does a very good job of translating that to the screen. Pat, you talked about this the majority of this constantly being shot in close-ups, but correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't close-ups in the cinematic language supposed to kind of translate kind of innermost thoughts, and kind of, since a majority of this is close-ups, it's kind of translating across the inner fear and just paranoia and just misery of these characters. I think the show does a phenomenal job of displaying that.
Yeah, I think you're stuck with the characters. And I think with so many great actors, it works. Dominick, the character, is to me, he's such a bad guy, kind of. I don't well,
it's tricky.
Hate him, but at the same time,
he's not
you're witnessing
person,
him.
But
yeah, he's such a complicated character, which is what I like about it. As opposed to Thomas, Thomas, I felt was the opposite. I felt he was pretty straightforward. Cuts off his hand. He's kind of whisked away to the mental hospital. And this is really Dominick's story. And Thomas comes out to play when, Dominick needs to really feel the pressure. And, you just see it. He definitely kind of goes in a whirlwind, specifically when everything's hitting the fan, and he got into a car accident and he's dropped off at this house that he's renovating, and they tell him, "Hey, not today. We want you to leave." And he has nowhere to go. He's stuck at this house, and all he can think about is his brother. And so he just says, you know what? Forget it. I'm just going to ignore them. I'm going to do this little bit of shutter work. And I'm also going to take these, what were they? Anxiety pills?
Something like I think.
Yeah, it's not painkillers or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, yeah. So he takes all these pills, which are painkiller. And, he's doing work on a 3-story house. and you're just like, man, you're just making bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. And
it becomes a little one-sided after a while.
Yeah. And then this particular scene, like, he's sort of in a delusional state. I think he might be hallucinating a little bit. And just from all the pressure. And it turns out that the owner of the house was decided to put a gun in his mouth.
Just decided to kill himself out of nowhere. And it's a really random scene too.
Yeah, but the thing is, I like how it's constructed because, did that guy really kill himself, or did Dominick kind of
hallucinate the whole thing?
Hallucinate, there is a semblance that, he might have imagined this, fell, injured himself, and he never goes back to the house. So we're not going to get proof either way. Mm-hmm. This show tends to be pretty literal, so I'd imagine that the character did kill himself. But I think that's the magic of the medium, is that he's in such a hallucinogenic state, or just like out of it, that we can see it going either way, and it's never explained. So it's like up to you, the viewer. Was he in such a bad state that he just imagined this horrific thing, or did it actually happen?
Right. And Brian, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say, especially at that point, it wasn't even that. He was even thinking about all the stuff. Like at that scene, he was actually having flashbacks of Dessa with his life, with his ex-wife before they broke up, and it was almost like all this is building up, and you're seeing them having like this lovey-dovey moment, and then you're just like, and it kind of explodes in a sense with the guy,
Yeah, definitely, quite literally.
And the way it was shot with their faces like lining up, it's like. It's not just him, it's they're both getting the shot,
Yeah, Brandon, were you on set that day when they shot that scene?
I was on that. I was actually like right at the bottom of where he
falls.
Of
the ladder where he falls? Okay.
I guess right of screen.
Got it. The scene where he falls, was that I assume that was a stunt double?
He did.
Or
it was
that actually
a
him?
little of both.
Okay.
He did stuff, it's just,
just typical day,
just making movie stuff.
Of course, yeah, and it's funny because the whole thing with that scene, and just with the show, is that kind of feeds into the overall theme in general of the show, which is kind of like coming to terms with your past so that it doesn't dictate your future, I guess, is kind of the one overall takeaway. Because this show was another one of those shows that's playing around with a lot of different themes, like a lot of different themes. And so it became kind of hard to focus on one thing after another. Like at one point, it was about like you kind of always had that sense of underlying family lineage. But for the most part, the show focuses on mental health. But it was really interesting because the whole thing is that I've seen a lot of different things take a look at mental health, but usually they kind of regard it as like this very Hollywood folk thing. Like there's been numerous Hollywood productions where they kind of just use mental illness as either like a complete crutch as like a really dumb plot point, or almost like a superpower. Like that's another thing that I've seen recently, is that they're using like mental health illnesses as like superpowers. Like there was that movie that Jacob Lattimore was in 2017. I can't remember, but it was the fact that like he was autistic, but because he could like count cards, that like made him a superhero.
Yeah, it was almost like romanticizing it,
Kind of, yeah. But the thing I like so much about this show is this show was probably like one of the most brutally honest looks that I've seen at it. Which is that like it's not all fun and games. It could be like a real burden at times, but like you still have to deal with it. And the thing that I liked that all the actors did in terms of like kind of bringing that to the surface is that like all just kind of played it as down to earth as possible. I don't think there was a single showy performance in any of these episodes.
No, and that was the one thing that Derek really. The one thing Derek really wanted to strive for. This show wanted to be as real as possible. Right. I mean, like. And watching it, you just get, like you said, there's no showy performances. It's literally like you're watching someone, like the way I kind of saw it as the whole show is, everyone, Dominick, he kind of is trying to fix his family. He thinks that he's the only one going through all this stuff. And you find out, like you said, everyone has this baggage, like all this baggage. And in the beginning, you're like, oh, you're really rooting for Dominick to do all this stuff. And you're seeing him after like over and over fail as a brother, and he feels like he fails. And even at the end, he's like, I failed him, And I think as a whole, it's just the whole story is just about how you're not alone. It's not like you're the only one going through stuff. It's literally everyone around you. And you find that out even with the manuscript, you know, it's like Dominick, I feel like growing up, he thought he was, you know, he was always the better brother because he didn't have this mental, like he didn't have schizophrenia and all this stuff. And with the manuscript, he's reading his grandpa's like, oh, this is for all the Sicilian, this is for the future men of
the future
Sicily or whatever.
Tempestios, I think was their mom's maiden name.
Tempesto.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just even that he's like, you realize his grandpa is not a great guy. And it's just like, you know what, people in general,
to say the least.
I mean, say the least, he wasn't a great guy, but I think the show overall was just like, you know what, people aren't good or bad. They're just human, you know, like,
right.
And that was a big thing that rang true with me, like through the whole entire show, you know, like every action they did, I wouldn't say it was bad, but it was just like, it really plays with.
It was just human. Like, it was humans make choices and they're not necessarily good or bad.
And that's even one thing that Dr. Patel says to Dominick, you know, just like your grandpa, just because he's a bad person doesn't mean you're going to be a bad person. Just because you see this like repetition, like you can break the cycle whenever you want. And she was even said, like, he made those choices. You can make your own choices.
Right.
And you see that because the whole thing is like, he doesn't know who his dad is. His mother, his stepfather would physically abuse his mother, all this stuff. And you're just like, wow, that's really like a crappy life. And he's like, no one else has gone through that, but he's just like, you're reading the story. His mother had a crappy life too. His grandpa, like, you know, all that stuff. And it's just like, you can change that. You don't, you know, and also another thing is let the past die, you know, just because that happened doesn't mean.
Ironically enough, quoting everyone's favorite Star Wars movie from the last decade.
Honestly, big Kylo Ren fan, not gonna lie.
Me too. He's my favorite character.
Let the past die, and it's the truth. I mean, and that's what the story is about. I mean, at the end, you finally, even though, you know, unfortunately, you know, Thomas dies, and he's almost like lifted of this burden, but like
it doesn't feel
Dominick. It doesn't at first. It doesn't feel like it, but then you realize, like Dominick realizes, just because all these bad things are happening doesn't mean it's the end of the world, you know, and. After I feel like his one visit with Dr. Patel, she's like, you know, I know you've been looking for a father this whole time, but hasn't Ray been there for you from the beginning? And you're just like, no, like he's been a jerk the whole time.
Right.
And then, but it's like, that's all you got. And it's, you know, that happened in the past, you know, you got to recognize it. And if you guys are trying to be better at it, you know, it's what you got. So make it work. And you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that. I'm actually glad you brought that up because that was a plot point from from the last episode, I should say, that I wasn't necessarily a fan of at first, because obviously just going back to the manuscript, you know, because the whole thing is that Dominick is not necessarily the best guy. I personally never really had a problem with him. I'm like, yeah, he's just a regular guy trying to get through it, but like he kind of regarded himself as like this terrible person. It was kind of like always harder on himself. You know, I think that was a lot of blame that came from obviously the death of his and Dessa and his ex-wife Dessa's kid, you know, which is obviously a very tragic moment, and kind of the way he reacts and kind of how he always feels about Thomas and everything. And it's kind of like almost like he's beating himself up for something that's not really his fault. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of see that explored more when he gets his grandfather's manuscript and he learns the history of who his grandfather really was. And I mean, if you thought that Dominick was like an unlikable person, like then you meet his grandfather and you're like, oh no, his grandfather's like a scumbag, like a straight up scumbag.
Yeah. And that was something that I was just like, watching those episodes, I was just like, oh my God, like Dominick's like he's realizing, you know, like,
yeah.
His grandpa was always this, like his mother always talked very highly of him and stuff, and then he's just this jerk.
And then you actually see him as a person, and you're like, oh wow, you want to talk about romanticization? Jesus Christ, that's just something I wanted to get into. Yeah.
And then you also, sorry, I didn't need to.
No, you're fine.
You just also see the parallels between the whole family. You know, it's like Dominick thinks, in a way, Dominick thinks he's the better brother, and he has to fix everything. You know, he has to set things right. And his grandfather's like, I'm the best, like, of his brother. And he has to set things right and like set this precedent for future men of Sicily, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like that thing that it's a kind of a stigma that I notice with kind of like just caretakers in general, you know, when it comes to like having to take care of like somebody who can't necessarily take care of themselves. It's like they kind of have that stigma, because I know my grandma had that exact same mental stigma just with my dad and my aunts growing up, like kind of this feeling like she always had to protect them. Not that my grandpa was abusive, you know, but like my grandpa was my grandpa. As like
everyone,
this
you know,
they
have it's you know,
everyone's got that. Yeah. Everyone's got that family member, you know, with like just that constant feeling of like,
and someone's always the older brother, you know, protecting the little brother, and that's kind of, you know, that's I feel like Dominick was, you know, they're twins, but you know, like Dave said, he was like. he was the one who kind of stood up for them both.
Right, exactly. And so that actually brings me into kind of like Pat, because you talked to me extensively about how the flashback sequences with Dominick's grandfather were your favorite parts of the show. So,
I think it's one of those things where you're so vested in Dominick's like mindset and you're with him like the majority of this time. And then episode 5 starts and you're back in time. This man and his brother just came over from Italy, and this whole thing plays out up to the point where he wants to teach his brother a lesson, and his brother's sort of like whoring around, sleeping with all these married women, and so the brother's just like, hey, police officer, you might want to go home early tonight and see what your wife's doing. and
we all know how that turns out.
Yeah. And it basically is the beginning of like, oh my God, this guy is
horrible,
a psychopath. My favorite thing is on this voiceover, this like Godfather 2 voiceover, where it's like, my brother on his deathbed made me promise to take care of his monkey. And it like cuts to the cage of the monkey. And I'm like, that monkey's dead.
That monkey is so dead. Like not that
they got the characters so right. That it's like the second this monkey made a screech, I was like, there's no way this guy keeps that monkey alive. And I'm like, he's going to pull out a gun, take it out. And it's actually much worse than I imagined.
So much worse. To the point, like, it's just so you guys that like mild spoiled, but he pulls the monkey out of the cage, puts it in a burlap sack, and tosses it off a bridge into the river.
You forgot the bricks that are in there, Dom.
The bricks too.
The bricks are in there.
Because that's what's going to keep the monkey down.
Yeah, to say the least. And it's just like it's almost like kind of like I said, I hate like the idea of like that's honestly like a common stigma with mental illness is like kind of like not wanting to lean on your problems as a crutch, but it almost like kind of makes Dominick's problems that he's dealing with Thomas kind of almost seem laughable compared to like, oh wow, this is the guy that like was kind of the template that your family's modeled after, so much so that it actually led to, I would say, like a popular, not a popular, but like a theory, a common, well-known theory amongst people who were watching the show that like, was their grandfather their father? Which, Brandon, maybe you can give me some insight of that. Like, was that something? I mean, obviously, like I said, you were privy to the whole thing. You were reading the book during the production of the whole thing. But like, was that a thought that like kind of ever crossed your mind?
Yes, because I remember when we were filming those scenes where. We're getting to the point. So I'm like, all right. So I was asking around. I was like, so like, I don't know if you guys can tell me, but like, who's the father? Like, who's the dad?
Like, what's going on here?
And the pieces started getting together. And as I was reading the book, and I was like, it was leaning towards the grandfather being the father. And I was just waiting for it to be said and be like known that it was it. But I was really glad that it wasn't, because that would have just made this so much more of a tragedy.
A tragedy. You can call what it is, a tragedy.
And I'm glad it isn't. I like the way it went, but I'm glad they kind of made you think that too, because everyone's like, I mean, if it's already this messed up, what, just add another thing to it,
Exactly.
Yeah, I wish they made us think about it longer. It starts in episode
really
5,
come into play until like the 5th episode. Yeah, I thought that would be something that would kind of like be more played out from the first for the first couple episodes, but like it really didn't come into play until you started reading the manuscript.
I think maybe if I had it my way, maybe one more episode earlier and just have a little longer to digest with Dessa.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's the moment of the show which expands it beyond just the two brothers and their immediate family. And it goes into the extended family, and it introduces this whole idea of the grandfather being cursed, and the whole idea of like the sins of the father being passed down and the curse going for generations. And I almost felt like this could have definitely gone in like some paranormal type of way. Like if you wanted to make a season 2, that he should have been cursed and been chased around by some demons. But I don't know if that would do the source material justice.
That doesn't exactly seem like the type of show that this was. But
no, but the idea of this curse and the fact that Dominick is sort of believing this, and just like, it shows you sort of that he's at wit's end and grasping for any type of straw that would explain why his life is so shitty. And, it's easily explained. It's your attitude, bro. You know, you just got to look at things a little bit differently. And
just got to look on the bright side of life.
Yeah, you just got to pop on Monty Python DVD.
Exactly.
And get
now
over
you're
it.
Getting it. Monty Python, key to all things nasty in the world.
Yeah, so I kind of definitely appreciate that manuscript, and just like the additional torment that it gives the Dominick character, because he wants the answers and he thinks that there is an explanation for everything. Right. And, it turns out that, this is life.
Bro.
You gotta
like, sorry, bro.
This is life, buddy. It ain't pretty.
It's like you're just rolling with the punches,
everyone else is.
Yeah. And that was one thing I wish there was more of the Italians, because one thing I became good friends with them, and finally seeing them on screen, I'm just like, yes. And I remember doing all the background stuff. And even if like I just wish we explored the manuscript a little more. With that being said, though, I think it really is an eye-opening thing, because I mean, Dominick, like you said, Patrick, he's looking for these answers, man, and he's not getting them. And like you just want Dominick to find something that's good in his life. Maybe his dad was like a good guy, or or his grandpa was a great guy, and it's just another like theme of just being like, life is life, and we're all human. And you know what? A lot of people are pretty bad, like, are kind of crappy, and they do bad things,
And it's funny because that actually ends up playing into kind of the final twist of the show, which is that, obviously, before we start to wrap things up here, which is the fact that in the end, after kind of the events of the final episode, that being obviously Thomas's death, the funeral, their stepfather Ray's massive heart attack that results in him going to a nursing home, and he ends up gifting their mother's house, their mother who had died years previously from cancer, to Dominick. And so he actually confesses that shortly before her death, their mother did confess to their stepfather, Ray, the true identity of their father, who turns out was not their grandfather, but ironically enough, the father of a Native American man that Dominick knew growing up, named Henry Drinkwater, portrayed by Michael Grey Eyes from True Detective. And the whole kind of twist where that comes from is the fact that when they were kids growing up together, Dominick was annoyed by Henry's twin sister, and as a result ended up kind of like ratting her out to the principal, and as a result she ended up committing suicide, which led to a lot of bitter enmity between Henry and Dominick for years. But as it turns out, Henry was also working as a janitor at the facility where Thomas ended up being locked up, and was able to get Dominick some much needed information that allowed him to get his brother out. And so when Dominick finds out this revelation from Ray and he confronts Henry about it, Henry's like, wait, you didn't know? Like, I've known for years. And he's like, I just found out. I never knew. And it's funny because that moment, when I first watched it, I'm like, I kind of felt like this came out of nowhere. I'm like, okay, this kind of just felt like one of those last minute like reveals, like one of those gotcha moments, right? But then I started thinking about it, and I realized it kind of had the same effect on me as the ending of another recent HBO miniseries, that being the third and most recent season of True Detective. Ironically enough, another HBO show that Michael Grey Eyes appeared in, which is that kind of giving you kind of the happy ending that you didn't expect from just a show that was filled with just so much misery and grief, to the point where it's like, oh, so at the end of the day, like, people are actually capable of getting some happiness out of just the misery, seemingly the not, as True Detective coined, the never ending flat circle of life, And I don't know, I kind of really enjoyed that, like,
for sure. Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where it was just like, you get to the end and you're like, oh, what? You're like,
okay. It's a turn, and I'm like, and you're like, okay, and
that's one good thing, and you're like, You know what? I liked Ralph this whole time because Ralph was helping them out.
Yeah. And Ralph's like kind of the likable character. But it's another one of those things because the problem is that, and kind of why it feels like the gotcha moment, just from a structural standpoint, is that it's only hinted at in the beginning of the last episode. Like, there is nothing to suggest that for the entirety of the show. Like, the only thing that we have to base that off of is the thing that we knew from the second episode with Dominick and Henry's sister from when they were kids. You know, like, that's all that we have to go off of.
Yeah, I kind of wish there was either more breadcrumbs or bigger breadcrumbs, because the moment when he confronts him and basically the guy responds like, Dominick, when you got in front of the whole school and you read that BS eulogy that was, we know is a lie. It's like, I wanted to kill you. Like, I wanted to feel that anger of just like, well, this is how Dominick dies. No, but it turns out, you know, they reconcile because he never knew and he was a dumb kid. And this is sort of like a forgivable moment. You know, they're never going to be like besties, but at least they can come to an understanding. And, you know, I thought that moment of closure could have definitely been, you know, planted the seeds a little bit more or just a little bit bigger. But ultimately it's like, I feel like that final episode was just like story. And it was all good.
Kind of like, but it was also kind of like, why couldn't this have been spread out for the rest of the 6 episodes?
I feel that, but I feel like, but I agree with that, but I feel like I kind of got a feeling that there was something going on, not just, you know, excluding myself from working on it. You see Nabby, the Drinkwater, like Ralph's ancestor, who was also there working, who was also fighting. And there's like, they're always like, their lives are always, you know, meeting together. And then you meet Henry as a boy with his mom and you're like, oh, that's another Drinkwater. And I kind of like, but again, you don't see that until the last few episodes, but you do like until you see the manuscript. But even as kids, you know, Ralph and his sister, Penny, they're the other set of twins, you know, and they're seen as like the not as the like, as you said, the dirty twins. And then there was the Thomas and Dominick, and they were like the white twins. And then that time, you know, that's just how it was. And they were, you know, really frowned upon. And even to the point where, you know, he blamed, you know, her stealing something, what got her in trouble. And then she disappears and then she gets murdered, you know, like she's murdered and tossed into the river like garbage, you know?
Yeah.
And everyone's like, oh, they have a little thing and then it's over. And then, you know, he didn't get to, you know, live his life with his twin. You know, he felt separated, and Dominick now is feeling that. And it's almost like at the end of the show, like Ralph was kind of, you know, helping him, but also like not helping him, because he's like, dude, I've been mad at you this whole time because you basically, like, you know, I've been jealous of you. You know, my sister was murdered. You guys are just, I've always known that we were like a family, and you've done nothing. Like, you've said nothing. Like that speech you said was fake, like all this stuff. And now you're just coming to me. And that's the whole thing. You know, is Dominick coming to get money from him now that he's not a janitor anymore and he's running a casino? Like, for me, I think it was a little like, I do agree the breadcrumbs could have been a little bigger, but I definitely think they were there.
They were there, but it was definitely like very subtle how they were played out, almost to the point where they weren't noticed. And I'm actually, real quick before you get to that, like, because the whole thing, right, is that I knew for a fact that like in the book she was murdered, but I could have sworn in the show they said it was suicide. But like maybe I missed that.
She was murdered. Yeah, she has like the newspaper clippings. Someone like murdered her, like kidnapped her. And murdered her. Yeah,
got it. Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting though, because it's kind of like at the end of the day, it's like the catharsis is that it's we're kind of all miserable and screwed up, and we kind of have nothing left because we've just everything that we enjoyed and loved has just been stripped away. But we kind of just like are existing with each other now because, you know, we're people, and who else do we have? And it's kind of the same thing that happens with Dominick and Ray, where Dominick went so much of his life just hating and blaming Ray because of his treatment of Thomas and them. But at the end of the day, it's like, you're kind of like, you know, my mom's dead. Man. Yeah, my brother's dead. Like, everything else is gone. You're literally all I have, you know? And it's kind of like, it's so interesting because like, that's so not the ending, like the typical Hollywood ending, where the typical Hollywood ending is just to patch everything up with such a nice little bow. And this just doesn't do that, you know? And I feel like that's something that like Derek has become famous for, because like I said, I haven't seen Place Beyond the Pines, but I'm familiar with how it ends, or like as Pat said with the passing of the torch moment, and I know that it's something kind of very similar where it doesn't get patched up in a nice, neat little bow, like at all. And I guess kind of my thoughts on it, if I'm getting now into my final thoughts, is that kind of the messiness of that and the humanity of it kind of allowed me to forgive some of the more problematic elements that I had, like specifically with the pacing and with certain of the story elements. But yeah, this was still to me like a very enjoyable experience. It was kind of, in a strange way, a very therapeutic experience.
Oh, for
if
sure.
That makes any sense.
No, I totally get that, because I literally watched the show and I was just like, there's certain parts, I didn't go through the same things that Dominick went through, but there's a lot of things you can connect to with, like with family. We all, we've all walked our own paths and had things with our families and all that stuff, and it's just like, you've been Dominick. I feel like everyone's been Dominick at some point trying to fix.
I have the same name as him, so that works.
Yeah, or like has been a character in that, in a sense. We've always been that one person who's trying to help, and it's just hard because Dominick just wants to do everything himself, and I feel like everyone. That's another thing. Like everyone just tries to fix everything on their own when they really do need help, and you just need to accept the help.
Yeah,
and that's another big theme that I think was a part of this too.
Accept the help, but not the help.
Yeah,
because for obvious reasons. I'm sorry, I had to go there.
Yeah, when Rosie O'Donnell shows up and offers help, take it. Listen to her.
Oh no, yeah, for sure.
She surprised me because I don't know. The last time that I really knew Rosie O'Donnell was like The View, and she left suddenly and all that stuff, and she comes back and she gets on screen and she's in this show, and it's like from the moment she shows up as the character, the social worker, it's like this is damn, this is great.
This is great. That was, if I would, like I said, Brandon, I know you and I talked about this show's Emmy potential for a little while. And honestly, after having watched it, I'm officially of the opinion of like, it's Ruffalo or bust, because I'm trying to think of some of the other competition of like, Aaron Paul, Hugh Jackman, but like, nobody else to me comes close to what he did. But
one question I did have, because I was reading a couple articles kind of preparing for this, and apparently the ending has a couple interesting things that are not in this show. If you want to read that spoiler, go ahead.
Wait, you're talking about the book?
Yeah. So it's interesting, but go read the article if you want to find out. Or read the book, which would be better.
That too.
Just read the book. I'm telling you, read the book. I'm telling you.
I was planning on reading the book, and then this article is just like, hey, here's the ending of the book. I'm like, oh, great.
Yeah, like I said, there were like I glazed. I kind of spark noted the summary of this in order to prepare for this episode, and I admit there was a lot of stuff that came in that last episode. I think there was like way more that came in with the living girlfriend Joy, played by Imogen Poots, that like wasn't there in the finale. I think there was like one other thing with him and Dessa that they ended up doing. I think did they end up like
they had a whole.
Okay,
I think so.
You're just ripping off the duct tape, Dom, because
literally, I'm just trying to
leave a little mystery.
You're trying a little mystery, and you're just like, oh, Pat, this happened.
Pat, if you know anything about how Chris and I were doing the show, you know that when it comes to the show, ambiguity and suspense go out the window.
Well, like, I love spoilers. I ruined Infinity Wars for my students. So this was 8 months later,
dude. It's a Marvel movie.
8 months later.
8 months later, they should have seen the movie by this point.
But they like yelled at me.
Of course they did. They're college students who got a Marvel movie spoiled for them. Of course they're going to yell at you. But
yeah.
So if we can kind of dive into closing thoughts here. So I know this much is true. Taking aside the humble bias that I feel like we all have towards it, consider the fact that it was shot in an area that all three of us are very familiar with. Literally to the point where Pat, the apartment complex scenes with Dominick was shot in your hometown of Pleasant Valley, like to the point where they literally had like the sign with like the Pleasant Valley Estates where they were shooting with his apartment. Brandon, for having worked on this,
that made me laugh just to see the Pleasant Valley Estates.
I saw that too. I didn't know they were keeping that in there, honestly, because I remember a lot of time we were taking signs down. Even Seasons place in Fishkill, it was supposed to be a Friendlies, and they're like, I should keep it. I'm like, all right, cool.
That works. Yeah. So kind of with that being said, I know this much is true. Is a show. It's a very honest show. It's a very kind of brutal show to watch. It's a very sad show, but it's a show that you can kind of get something out of. And it's kind of not the ideal show that you would want to be watching. especially during a global pandemic. You know, it's kind of like, oh, I kind of wanted. It's kind of one of the reasons why Disney Plus is flourishing so much right now, because a lot of people just want to like, hey, I just want to watch something kind of happy in order to turn my brain off to and not really think about the real world. And this show was kind of like, oh no, this is still what's happening in the real world, kind of even more so now that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. A little bit, yeah. But
it's like, oh, you didn't have problems before.
What was like, you ain't
going to make you reflect. That's the one thing the show
did.
They made me reflect, man. I was just like, oh, I've done that. I need to go like take a shower.
But again, it's kind of like what has happened during the pandemic. It's like everyone's been stuck in their houses with nothing to do for like a couple months now. You know, what else do they have to do but reflect? You know, like alcohol only gets you so far. But just put it out there. But I'm just saying. So it's a show that kind of like, it may not be the show that you're looking for, but it might be the show that you kind of need to go. You know, great performances. I personally think it's very well shot. I think that despite some problematic story elements, I think that there's a lot here of substance that can be gained. And I think that anybody who ever has suffered from any form of mental illness or is going through any sort of affliction with mental illness or just like anything related to depression will be able to get something out of the show. So for my money, if I'm rating it out of 5 stars, I'm going 4 out of 5 stars.
Yeah. Well, Dom, I'm going to agree with you that this is a really fantastic show. You know, I think 4 out of 5 stars sounds really good. And what I will say is go ahead, watch this. It made me really want to pick up the book and kind of read it. So that's where I'm going next. But in terms of like watching the TV show and going down this sort of dark rabbit hole and dealing with, you know, the complex nature of mental health, you could always watch a Juliette Lewis movie. Well, it's not really her, but she's in it. It's called Ma.
Oh, right? Okay. All right.
And if you need
natural born killers, I'm like, don't you dare.
I would say natural born. I was waiting for him to say natural born killers. I'm like, what was it in that?
But
like, no.
If you watch this show and you're depressed, just go watch Ma.
It is that movie's hilarious.
Fantastic. It is a great like palate cleanser. You know, that pickled ginger to your sushi for this show. And
ironically enough, directed by the same guy who directed The Help.
Yeah, you'll get out of your funk if you watch Ma right after this.
Oh my god, that's actually on my list on HBO that I have to watch.
I was like one of the few movies I missed from last year that I'm still pissed that I missed.
Oh, you haven't seen it yet?
No, I haven't.
I haven't seen it yet either. I'm gonna go watch it now though.
I heard it's nuts.
Okay, it's one of those things where I don't know what they were thinking, but they did. It's fantastic. It's not by any means like this is your top 100 movies of the 2000s, you know,
but it's certainly one hell of a ride.
There's a certain, you know, funny bone factor to it. And I think watching I Know This Much Is True and being like depressed and down and then frivolously throwing this on,
it works as a good palate cleanser.
Yeah, it just put a smile on my face, made me forget about Dominick's and Thomas and everybody's problems, you know, and then I can go on living life now.
Absolutely. So out of 5 stars, what would you give this?
I would give Ma 2, but this I think 4 out of 5 is perfect for I Know This Much Is True. Awesome. And after I read the book, I might go up, but we'll see.
Awesome. And Brendan, with your closing thoughts, now you worked on it, you saw your baby, it's finally been produced, you did it. Congratulations, you worked on an HBO show.
Repping the shirt. I actually got the shirt on right now of Three Rivers. But
so
I mean, what would you star-wise? Closing thoughts, honestly.
Stars.
All right.
That's how we do this
Closing
year.
Thoughts. From being on the show and seeing it finally out and about, I loved it. I'm so glad of what we did and how it was produced and just widely how many people have enjoyed it, you know, and the message it has, you know, and it's just shot so beautifully. Like I saw it being shot and I was like, oh, this is going to be good. But after seeing it, I'm just like, I worked on this. My name's in the credits. Like, it's crazy that I'm attached to this, you know, and it's just like, it's awesome. I don't even know what else to say. Like, there's no words for it. It's just like such a great feeling. And honestly, it's funny. I finished it today and I was crying. I cried a little bit, like nothing full blown, but I was just like, wow, that sucker punched me in the feels, and I was just like, wow, it was just beautiful. That's all I got to say. It was beautiful. And between the soundtracks and the visuals and just being on it overall, I can't say anything negative about it, because it was just such a great experience and great seeing it, out and about.
Of course. So out of 5 stars?
Out of 5 stars, I don't want to be like that guy, but I'm going to be like 4.8, 4.7, I don't want to I don't want to be like perfect and be like, oh, it was perfect because I was on it, but
regular Chris once gave something like a 3.254 out of 5. I'm not kidding. Like, so that is, you are no stranger here. That's fine.
I was going to say, if I'm going to do it, I'll go with 4.8. 4.8, my final.
That works.
My final.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. So, Brendan, thanks again for being here. This was awesome.
Thanks again for having me on. I hopefully, I give you guys a little insight and.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of the first thing. Like, I mean, I wanted to have you on earlier, but like the minute that I saw this coming out, I'm like, oh, we got to get Brandon on.
This is perfect. Oh, I even remember when it was going on, I was talking to you because it was just like, I was like, Dom, like, you got to get in the background. Like, have you signed up for this yet?
They kept denying me. I almost made a whole thing on there too, and then I know.
And with that, and it was being what they're doing. Yeah. And especially what they were doing, like a lot of the twinning, they had to have the same exact people. Like, it's crazy, some of the stuff that the people had to like sign up for, and it was crazy.
Ridiculous. So Brandon, with that being said, what's called? You got any socials that you want to plug? Like, where can
I'd love to plug some socials. I have my own little production company. We make short films and stuff. Production House 45. Go give us a look on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. PH45 just looks up, and then Twitter it's P House 45 because it just wouldn't fit. So, but at Production Force 45 and all that stuff, we got some short films and stuff coming out. Follow us, stay updated, and all that.
Awesome, good stuff. Yeah, I know you guys. You guys actually screened a couple of my short films.
I was going to say that was great, and hopefully we'll be doing more of that stuff. We've just been kind of silent because we're in the process of we're in pre-production of another short film that we're trying to shoot, and everything going on.
Yeah, the fact that you guys can still produce stuff given the pandemic is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's really right now we're kind of just stuck in pre-production. We're not really we can't really shoot anything right now, but we're making sure we're biting off a big chomp on this one. So
that's good. That's really good. I'm looking forward to it. Can't wait to see what you guys have in the pipeline. Pat, plug in the socials. Where can the good people find you online?
Yeah, these days basically just nesting on Instagram at Patrick W. Huber. I think my latest photo that I threw on there was a chipmunk, all its cuteness. I have tons of other chipmunk photos and birds, and I've been doing some wildlife. I also made some pretty interesting Middle Eastern kebabs. So I took a picture. I basically was messing around with shutter speeds and got the smoke of the charcoal grill. And so, whatever, I'll probably end up posting these things eventually.
Point.
That's the type of content I like, though. That's the content I need to.
Yeah, right now it's weird because school's over and I'm just like getting my hands back on a camera, and I'm ready to go outside. Oh,
I feel that.
So it's been very interesting.
Just be safe. Just be safe, you guys.
Absolutely. So. And of course, guys, I'm of course the movie nerd. Unfortunately, my co-host Chris Evanko, the TV nerd, could not be here today, but that wasn't stopping us from getting you guys quality content here on the Talkin TV YouTube channel. Please leave us a like and a subscribe and leave a comment if you can. What did you guys think, guys? We really had like a real celebrity today, so like
I'm not a real celebrity.
You are, Brandon. Own your stance. Major HBO show. Own your stance. So whatever you guys thought, please leave it in the comments below. If you have not watched I Know This Much Is True yet, please go and watch it. I would heavily recommend it on HBO Go. Guys, pay the $15 a month for HBO Go or HBO
just
Max.
For the month. Just for the month. Just watch the show.
Exactly. Support your artists.
There's free trials.
Yeah, so that's what I did. It started out as a free trial. It's 6 hours. If you got 6 hours or change,
that is still a thing to do. Follow us on our socials: Facebook, Instagram at Talkin TV, no G, or at Talkin TV Podcast, whichever you prefer. We're a podcast on Anchor and Spotify and Apple Podcasts, anywhere else that you can basically listen to podcasts in audio format, with the exception of SoundCloud. And Have a good night. Stay safe. And as always, people, watch more fucking movies because Chris isn't there to actually cue me to do that.
I've been waiting for you to say that. It feels good to be on the show for that.
It's pretty good, right? It's pretty good feeling.
Yeah, and watch more TV shows.
And read more books.
Read some books. You know what? Read some books.
Definitely read more books. I miss my cue there, but
read more fucking books.
And go outside, but be safe about it, all right?
We out.